Welcome to the Unfazed, Unedited podcast, where we provide commentary on complicated topics in an uncomplicated format. I am Dr. Shaunna Payne Gold, and I go by she, her, hers pronouns, and I am also in shock and awe that we are now in August. Here we are. Here we are. I don't know where the time went. I don't know how 7 months came and went so quickly, but Lisa, here we are with the first episode of the month. How are you?
hmm I'm doing good. Hi, everyone. Dr. Lisa here. She, her pronouns. It is 97 degrees outside. So, yay. Um, yeah, let's just not talk about the fact that it's August. Let's, let's move right along because that's when, we have existential crises brewing when we start to linger on the fact that it is now August.
Oh yeah, exactly, exactly. It is a crisis. Well, I usually take the month of August to be a little more lax, and I spent that time traveling this year, so I burnt that time a little bit, so I couldn't afford to completely put my feet up for the entirety of August. So here we are working, right, Lisa? But let's jump into our first
Yeah.
episode of the month because it is rich and thick. We are in the midst of a number of different world events, including, as we recall, the Olympics, the Paris 2024. And what I
Mm-hmm.
find so
Mm-hmm.
interesting is that our word of the week actually parallels all of that quite perfectly when it comes to identity, the word identity. Um, Identity is interesting, right? Because identity could be both how you perceive yourself and understand yourself in the world, and how other people perceive you. And those two perceptions may not match. And so that's why I think it's so important to explore identity and so forth, because we're just not always aligned. So, in individuals' characteristics usually are very deeply felt, but they are not always the self identity that connects with other people's perception. And grappling with that can be the challenge, right? So, Lisa, we know that this can come up in lots of different ways, whether it's stereotyping or not, or whether it could be complete misalignment, or maybe someone is transitioning in some way within their identity or identity groups. But identity is a tough one. It's a tough one. It sounds simple and does hard in real life and in interactions with other people in relationships.
Yeah. Well, and I think to break it down further, you have different categories of identity, right? So you have like the identity of an
Yes.
Olympian. I am an Olympian. I'm not an
Yes.
Olympian. But if I were, then I might identify as an Olympian, right? That might be a really important aspect of my identity. But we also have kind of social identities or um, like race, gender, sexual orientation, and they're different, right? Because they are parts of who you are, not necessarily an identity you have achieved. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
so people
Yeah.
could make assumptions by looking at me and say she's not an Olympian, and they could also say I read her as a woman, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's there's still a misalignment possible based on stereotypes for sure, but I do think identity is not a one size fits all, and there we need to have a bit more of a nuanced understanding of the word.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, I think that's how we kind of parlay into our phase one topic around identity and even opening ourselves up to other folks' identities. So I'll just slide right into some of my experiences, Lisa, coming back from our educational tour in Japan. Oh, Lord, let me just say, Lisa, that yeah, I think there needs to be like pre departure conversations, pre departure meetings, some type of education around cultural humility and cultural agility, right? And the reason why I say that is a very practical point, Lisa. So during our travels, we had a pretty good sized group, about 30 people, including mostly middle schoolers, as well as a few parents. And let me just say that, phrasing that people say all the time that I don't really care for, that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Sometimes I wonder if old dogs don't want to learn new tricks, right? Like, they can be taught, but are they willing to learn? I don't know. And that's exactly what happened on this trip with one individual I'm just keeping in mind, where it was almost an irritant that he was in a different country, in a different environment, in a different cultural religious space. And it was an irritant that this person did not find the United States of America in Japan. Like, what did you come here for? What did you come here for? And I have to say, it was so interesting to me that around about the time we were returning, this article came out with the New York Times in regards to not asking people to take their shoes off in their house, their apartment, etc. And again, I'm thinking to myself, just like our trip to Japan, if I was someone of Japanese descent, I am someone who is native to Japan. Don't expect me to bend over backwards for you who is visiting my home country. Same thing when it comes to my physical space. This is my home. I may have a home that is shoe free, if you will. So when I ask you to come to my home and expect you to take your shoes off because that's my cultural standard, then why are you ticked off about it? And so, Lisa, I think we have some learning to do and growing to do and agility to create in regards to how flexible are we when we don't get to flex our privilege of this is my house, this is my country, this is my background and experience, but it's someone else's. And the disrespect that can come up in ways that are just, it's intolerance to the 10th degree. And the frustration I felt witnessing this person in someone else's country, just having a stance of disrespect, right? Like, it wasn't an outward disrespect of individuals, but it was a stance of, how dare we go to a authentic Japanese restaurant and they serve authentic Japanese food? Where's the American food here? Excuse me, sir? No. So I just wonder how much of that is consistently with us all the time, every time we experience something different from our own experience. Ugh, I learned a lot. Let me just stop right there. I learned a lot from him.
Yeah, I mean, we're socialized, and if you've never left your home country, then, there's culture
Yeah.
shock, right? And I suppose that can force people to dig their feet in because they feel discomfort and they feel unwelcome, not necessarily because of what other people are doing, but because of their own discomfort being in this new space, right? And so then, they want American things because that makes them feel comfortable. So it's all about a lack of exposure, a lack of willingness to be open to new experiences because they might be different, and that might make me feel weird, and I don't want to feel weird. I just want my Diet Pepsi or whatever, right? The
Right,
shoe
right.
thing is funny. So the New York Times piece was related to if you're having a party in your house. These are all the recommendations that the Brazilian people gave. One of them was don't ask them to take your shoes off because it's rude. And I saw a couple of Instagram posts about that from comedians who identify as Asian and Asian American saying, well, apparently this person doesn't have any Asian friends, right? And I thought, and so you were in Japan or coming back from Japan, right? So it was a really interesting overlap because what little I know about Japanese culture, right? One of the things that I know is that it wouldn't be unusual for you to be asked to take your shoes off before entering someone's personal house or even a restaurant, right? Like that. I don't like, and so the idea of being like, no, I don't want to do that. I mean, I just never would say that. I don't like, I want to be supportive of people who feel discomfort in a new space, but I also feel like there's just a basic level of respect that you need to apply to those situations, even in the midst of your own discomfort, right? Um,
Yes, yes, yes.
and yeah, yeah.
Well,
So
and you're hitting the nail on the head though, because I've stopped counting, frankly, how many restaurants that we went to that there was an expectation to take your shoes off. They had slots when you first came in the door, slots to put your shoes in, or very small lockers that were big enough for your shoes to go in. And so it was an expectation. And then they would even have a couple of sets of slippers, for example, outside of the booth where you would go eat. So if you wanted to put slippers on, or if you'd like to put slippers on in order to go to the restroom or what have you. And so it wasn't as if Japanese culture wasn't meeting the rest of us halfway, you know? And so, yeah, I just found it so interesting, the stance of, intolerance and almost disgust that you would call me out of my comfort zone culture because I'm here visiting your country. Like, it just sounds ridiculous to me. It's literally like me saying, I'm coming to your house and I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do and what I'm not going to do in your house. Absolutely not. How dare, like, the level of privilege and blatant disrespect that takes. As I reflected back on some of the pre-meetings and some of the conversations we had prior to departure, where we were going to be there 9-10 days, when I reflected on it, we never had those actual conversations. We had conversations about logistics and safety, but we didn't have conversations about respect and cultural anything, cultural agility, cultural humility. We didn't have those conversations. So
Interesting.
yeah. And
Huh.
that's why I'm like, wait a minute, we had at least 3 to 4 meetings and none of them addressed cultural humility or cultural agility of any sort.
Okay, that's kind of shocking to me because the company that you went with is not a company that is new. It's been around for a very long time. It's
Exactly.
done international trips in a whole different
Exactly.
number of ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
cannot believe that they didn't provide a session on cultural norms in Japan, how to engage respectfully, some key things that you should try and remember. What's the if you see this it means this
Mm-hmm.
there, but it doesn't mean that here. That sort of thing. That's just
Very few.
extremely helpful when you're going into an entirely different culture.
No. The only
Hmm.
couple of things that I recall around those types of concerns was around, for example, if you're going somewhere and you're paying for something, how do you pay for it? Right? You put the yen in the tray, and they pick up the tray, and that's paid for rather than putting that in someone's hand. There were a few nuances here and there, but otherwise, I'm like, no, there really wasn't this reminder to expect difference in all different ways, places, spaces. So, yes, you're probably going to sit down at a restaurant and you may not see anything that you recognize on the plate. Okay. You're going to a restaurant that may have no English at all. How are you, those types of, so they gave you the logistics of, here's an app to help you to go from Japanese symbols to English, but there wasn't a conversation around the posture of respect, meaning that we are guests and they don't have to host us. And some of that privileged nuance. And I'm like, okay, maybe that's because we're working with middle schoolers here. Understood. But I'm thinking, come on, parents, get it together. So I was a little taken aback by that from a parent. Maybe a student I could tolerate it more from, but not an
Yeah.
actual parent. I'm like, that's a bit much.
Yeah, like a young person, 9, 10, 11, whatever, doesn't know, doesn't really understand. Some of this is going to go right over their head. But an adult, a fully grown adult, who is choosing to go to Japan, right, to accompany their child and to be there, um, okay, maybe it isn't. Like, I mean, I don't know that I'm shocked anymore, quite honestly, with people's behavior. I'm just feeling like, wow, right? These things that I
Yeah.
believe to be self evident in all my hopeful naivete are constantly getting hammered.
Oh, well, that's
So,
where
well,
I appreciate you bringing that up, because I won't go down this rabbit trail completely, Lisa, but maybe we'll circle back in another podcast to the conversation of common sense, meaning that the things that we think are common, that should be common, that this is a fundamental basis of how people should act and understand the world, may not be, and in fact should not be. And so, yeah, I thought some things were common sense too, but they were not on that trip. So here we are. But that adult was quite interesting. Let me put it that way. So yeah.
Yeah.
Ah,
Okay. So to wrap up here, it is not rude. It is not rude to ask someone to take their shoes off to come into your house, right? Not rude. Just
that's right.
underscoring that, right?
It is your house. You
um,
do what you want to do.
dear
It's
Lord,
your
dear
house.
Lord.
Right, right, right. So, well,
Yep, yep. And people should be respectful of that.
right. Exactly. Exactly. So, well, Lisa, let me tell you about, I guess this is just all of Shauna's offended moments for the last, few weeks or so. So, interestingly enough, you and I, we debrief lots of our trainings, experiences, and so forth. We never, put a client or, person we have a business relationship with. We certainly don't out them, of course, here in this space. But I noticed during a training, and this is not the first time I've noticed it, where there was an individual who was very uncomfortable with a um, an identity wheel that is often used by people like us, Lisa, people that are DI practitioners, educators, possibly trainers, so forth. And we use them as a helpful guide for people who are not in the practice of reflecting on their own multiple identities, all the ways in which they might describe themselves and understand themselves in the world, and how that may reflect against others or reflect in community with others or conflict with oneself and others. And so, as I've done countless times before, we used an identity wheel. And there was an individual in the space that really felt offended that we were, quote unquote, labeling, right? And if you're listening to this podcast on the YouTube, I'm actually doing the air quotes here, y'all. Um, and so when I reflected on it, because I'm always trying to improve the way that I deliver trainings and so forth, because no one's perfect and I'm always trying to be on this path of continuous improvement, I reflected on it and I thought, Lisa, maybe the person in the training and people that I've experienced before in other trainings, they're conflating the difference between labeling someone versus someone identifying with a group or a community or uh yeah, with an experience even, right? And as I thought about it, as much as I was frustrated with that experience, that person wasn't 100% off base, because no, I wouldn't necessarily want to or in ever intend to label someone in such a way that sounds insidious and harmful and othering. Yet at the same time, I have no problem thinking about my multiple identities and all the ways in which I identify or am in community with individuals, groups, experiences. And so I kept trying to like interpret this person's offendedness. I don't know if that's a word. I try to keep interpreting it, and I think, I don't know, Lisa. It may be that we need to revisit the identity wheel that you and I created to parse out that we weren't really talking about labeling. That wasn't the point of the exercise. So I don't know. I'm still reflecting on the experience because I want people to get it. I really do want people to get it.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, if you think about individuals who have never had their multiple identities named in any way, right? So that's mostly going to be people with privilege because they, walk
Mm-hmm.
through the world and they are not readily made aware of some of these in particular kind of socially constructed identities.
Mm-hmm.
Then if you're
Mm-hmm.
saying, hey, there's all these identities that exist, right? That is a little bit of a shock to the system, because if they're operating on this, we're all the same, we're the human race. There's if we name these things, then you're essentially creating inequality, right? Like, I mean, that's kind of a refrain that white
Mm-hmm.
people say all the time. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so I
Mm-hmm.
could see then a wheel, like a visual where you're saying, look at these identities on here and which of them do you have, and reflect at it,
Right,
could be
right, right.
really destabilizing for someone.
Yeah.
Um, I, I bet that this person was probably coming from a place of that if we name it, it makes it real. So we're not going to name it because to name it would be rude or would
Mm.
reveal something that I'm not willing to acknowledge, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
I
Mm.
yeah, I mean, I've never. I haven't come across someone who's gotten as offended as this person over the identity wheel. They might have dismissed it and been like, meh. But I've never experienced someone like outwardly challenge it.
Hmm. Yeah.
And it's disingenuous to me because him saying, why are we labeling people, as though he is this champion for not making assumptions about people, just doesn't fit that scenario at all, right? Like, he's not
Mm,
saying, Shaunna, we have to be careful about how we choose to name people because maybe internally they feel differently. And if we make assumptions based on some of the quote unquote labels on this wheel, then that might be
mm.
harmful. Like, that is not what he's talking about, right? Like, that, there's no way that's the position he's coming from, right?
It's well, to your great point, that's the reason why when someone's uncomfortable talking about identity, multiple identities, intersectionality, all that stuff, I don't want us to be in a place where we are assuming that, oh, the trainers are intentionally making me uncomfortable. They're enjoying it. They're taking great joy in watching me squirm as I think about these topics. But that's why I always call it the productive discomfort. Like, what are we producing out of the discomfort? I'm not here and getting paid to train a group of, whoever, just to see you squirm, because I don't want to waste time like that. What I'm here to do is to ask and think aloud about topics that you usually have not talked about or thought about, sometimes because of privilege, a lot of times because of the privilege of not having to. And at the same time, having a safer, more educated space to do so, right? Because I'm thinking about how many people that actually do want to have some of these conversations, but it's not that they don't feel comfortable having the conversation. They know that ignorance is in the room and it's not a safe place to have the conversation. It's different if they're in a space where, I'm having a conversation with Lisa about gender, and Lisa spent the majority of her life doing work around gender. I feel a little more comfortable there because somebody knows what they're talking about. Great. Yes, I want to do that there. So with that, I'm thinking to myself, okay, this person is not really interested in labeling folks to be malicious. I think it's this kind of intersection of, I'm uncomfortable and I don't want to talk about this, number one. And then number two, possibly the usual refrain we hear, Lisa, is that this is not a professional topic to talk about. And it depends on the generation of the colleague or the employee that says that, but they're usually on the upper end. They're usually older than Xers, probably boomers, that are like, wait a minute, this is not professional to talk about. But if I go down the scale of the younger employees, coworkers, they'll say, no, actually, it's integral to everything that we do here, and having that conflation in the workplace. So yeah, I think it's interesting. And so it has me rethinking the identity wheel itself and applying it in such a way that, you know, what are some of the things, lesson learned, what are some of the things that we're not doing with this experience? So labeling, we're not doing this because we understand labeling as this, we're doing this. Or we're not intentionally making folks uncomfortable with no end game. This is the end game to this activity. It's just making me rethink it as someone that's a learner. I want to make sure people in my space are learning from it, not stuck in their offense,
Right.
and the shock that you brought up before.
But I also don't think you should change your entire curriculum because of one dude, right?
Oh, definitely
Like,
not. Right. I
you
hear you.
know,
Yeah, yeah.
I think there could be an adjustment around when we talk about identities. We're not talking about Shaunna labeling someone based on how she perceives that person's gender, for example, right? We're talking
Yeah.
about how you understand yourself. And we're asking you to reflect on all of those pieces of the puzzle
Mm-hmm.
that make up who you are. But I don't think you
Mm-hmm.
need to like dramatically really shift and try to kind of bubble wrap and cushion, say we're not doing this, we're not trying to make you uncomfortable, because this is one person who had this. I mean, maybe other people felt that way and they just didn't articulate it, but I don't think I don't think his opinion is necessarily representative of the whole. I don't think he's alone, but I
Mm.
just think that this, so how is he exerting his privilege when he's no longer even in the room? Because you're thinking about shifting the way you even teach this based on that single person's
Mm-hmm.
feedback, right? So his
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
his power is still lingering, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
I do understand it's not that there's nothing to learn. I guess I would just caution you to
Mm-hmm.
rework it based on this one person's feedback when we know that this person is likely it's coming from a place of shock and privilege versus it doesn't feel an authentic critique to me.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. And to your point, there's something that you just brought up, and I know we need to move on, but um, even in that conversation, so remember, I was co-facilitating this particular activity. Now, I've facilitated it on my own in the past. I've co-facilitated it many times before. This time, I happened to be co-facilitating it, and the other individual did exactly what you just mentioned, starting with, I know this is going to make you uncomfortable. Aside from the discomfort, how do you feel about XYZ? So it was like planting this seed that we did not want to grow, right? We're not talking about discomfort. In fact, we're embracing discomfort. If it happens, great. If it doesn't, I used to have a supervisor that would say all the time, I am okay with you sitting in your discomfort. And that wasn't to be mean at all. That was, this is a safe space for you, almost like a greenhouse where, you have the space in place, and the intention is for you to feel a little uncomfortable for you to be able to grow. That's the whole point. So if you name your discomfort with the hopes of getting out of your discomfort, this is not the place for that, right? But yeah, that co-facilitator started with the discomfort, you know. If you feel uncomfortable, da da da, and I'm like, oh, well, I'm not sure we should have gone there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate revisit to think about how that's framed for
Mm-hmm.
sure.
Yeah.
Um, all right, so let's move along here to our last phase 3, and of course you know that Shaunna and I are big lovers of the Olympics, and we did a whole special on it. And she and I have been binging. I have been stepping away from my computer to watch various swimming finals, and the today was the oh, I actually forget what today was, but because I've been watching so much, it's actually blending together at
Women's
this point. But we
gymnastics.
love it.
Women's
Okay.
gymnastics were today. That was a big one. Yeah.
So we've noticed a couple of things that we wanted to bring up here because even though we love watching the Olympics, doesn't mean that there isn't some shit that happens that we want to call
Every
out,
time.
right? So we have a couple here. So some of you may have heard about this, but there was a commentator, a Eurosport commentator, a white guy, who was commentating on swimming. And after the Australian women's team, 4 Australian women swimmers won a relay, he made some comment to the effect of, "Oh, look, they're just finishing up. Women, you know what they're like, right? They just hang around and putting on their makeup, right?" And he says this live while commentating this swimming final. And he was with another woman commentator who I think was just aghast at this comment. And so in the moment kind of responded like, what? Or I don't know, made some attempt to address in the moment. But anyway, Eurosport has since quickly removed him from commentating the Olympics. So why was this dude even commentating, right? Because I'm almost certain
Mm-hmm.
this is not the first time he said shit like that.
Oh,
And
wow.
two, the Eurosport, I don't actually know much about that television channel, but they took him off. He's no longer commentating for the Olympics. My guess is he hasn't lost his job, but they've removed him from the Olympics, and they did it promptly, right? Because it sparked quite a lot of backlash. But also, so it's a good and a bad. You had a dude on there who said this stupid, who's probably said stupid shit before, and you just let it go, but you actually
Mm-hmm.
responded and did something about it. But I just feel like same shit, different day, right? We've talked so many times, Shaunna, you and I, about the ways
Mm-hmm.
in which commentators treat women athletes differently. They tend to focus on their motherhood and their caregiving.
Mm-hmm.
They don't pay that same attention to fathers who are also Olympians or elite athletes, and the
Yeah.
commentary on women's bodies, and if they look tired today, or all of this stuff, and you just don't hear that same level of critique. And it is in there,
Hmm.
like it's in the commentary. I've been hearing it, but this one was just particularly egregious. So I'm not sure
Oh
what
yeah.
you have noticed, or what your thoughts are on this particular example or others.
Well, let me just say that t- uh, again, you and I called this in our Olympic coverage. The very last segment, you specifically said, pay attention to how commentators speak about certain people, groups, and especially gender. And here it is, right? So we looked in our crystal ball and we saw this. We knew this already. What was very interesting, well, two things that popped in my mind as you were speaking, Lisa, is that, again, this is the first year where there has been gender equity or gender parity between men and women at an Olympics. I know for a lot of you all that are listening to this podcast right now, you're thinking, wait, what? There wasn't always, or at least close to? This is the first year that we've had some parity. So that's the first thing. That's the backdrop of this. And then the second thing, which I find interesting, is that another Olympian and co-host, a woman, Lizzie Simmons, kudos to her for immediately responding to Bob in the moment. And she said, outrageous, Bob. Some of the men are doing that as well. Right. So she named it right in the moment, which I think is just fantastic for, being quick enough to jump right on that, because usually it's like amygdala hijack by that point. It's like your brain is literally shocked that someone would say that. And so it's hard for you to respond. She did not have that moment, which I think is just, whoa, go, go, go. Um, and so, I think what's sad is that we predicted this. And at the same time, I'm glad that he was taken down, from Olympic coverage. I want to know what the longer term effects will be, in regards to this. Of course, he offered an apology, and I'm
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
yeah, okay, well, whatever.
Ah,
I'm at this stage and phase in my
yeah.
life that I don't care if it's the perfect apology. We should know better by certain things. Like going back to your common sense comment, it's like, this should be a
Yeah.
common sense moment. And so my
Right.
brain is not open to
Right.
processing your apology, because it shouldn't have happened in the first place. And the fact that you're saying I'm a massive advocate of
Exactly.
women's sport
Exactly.
is like complete bullshit. So, when I hear this, I'm like,
Yep. Yep.
goodbye. We do not need to see you on the world stage any longer. Goodbye. Farewell to thee. Go. No.
Yes. Yes. So we will not have to listen to him, at least for the Olympics. So,
Right,
okay,
right.
so the second thing I wanted to bring up is, some of you may have also seen the interwebs and social media have been splashed the last week or so with, I think, did you say she was Egyptian, right, Shaunna?
Yes,
An
yes,
Egyptian
yes.
athlete,
Mm-hmm.
fencer. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Nada or Nada Hafez. She completed in fencing in the individual saber. I say that like I know what that is. I really don't. But the individual saber fencing competition, she didn't she
Uh,
didn't make it past the round of 16, but she was 7 months pregnant, and so all of the media coverage has been like, oh my gosh, wow, isn't this amazing? This woman competed at the Olympics while she was 7 months pregnant. Subtext, look how lazy the rest of you are. Get off your asses and do something about it, right? Because this person who is debilitated through pregnancy cannot, she did it, so why can't you? I mean, that is what. And so I feel like all of this media coverage has really skirted and sometimes stepped over that line between an accolade for a job well done and something that was really cool, and then inspiration porn. And Shaunna and I have talked about inspiration porn before, but for those of you who are new or don't remember, it's when we elevate individuals, particularly individuals with disabilities, and say, wow, look at what they did despite this thing. And so then we create this kind of aura of amazement, as though they weren't capable of doing that. Like we had these low expectations. And so then able bodied people or non-pregnant people get inspired by the feats of excellence by individuals who you had presumed weren't capable of doing those things, right? So it's really, really problematic. It's not flattering. Um, so anyway, so this was an interesting twist because she is 7 months pregnant, right? So it wasn't necessarily, some people might call that a disability, others may not, right? There's some controversy around how that should be viewed. But what do you think about that, Shaunna? I'd love to hear your perspective
No,
related to
yeah,
this little situation.
yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I always have questions because I wonder if and when it was shared. Um, and I'm torn as well because of course, for many of us who follow the Olympic Games, we don't want just the numbers. We don't want just Lisa won gold and Shaunna won silver. We want to hear the story around how they got to the gold and the silver. And so I appreciate that story. Yet also at the same time, again, how is it kind of poking other individuals to think about, oh, well, let me use this, depending on how you view it, temporary disability. Because let me tell you something, when I was 7 months pregnant, I was doing good to walk from A to B, y'all. So yes, I understand. And at the same time, I feel like inspiration porn was also used around me, or maybe I used it too. I'm not sure. Around after I had my second son and I was back on the bike and I did my first triathlon in what I think he was 6 weeks old. As soon as I could swim again. And so lots of people see that in a particular way when I'm like, that's not really what it's meant to be. And this is not the first time uh, Nada has been to the Olympics, 2016, 2020, and now 2024. And I believe she was previously a gymnast, Egyptian national gymnast as well. So all this to say, this is a person with a very deep uh, athletic background, that knows her body well. We've seen other athletes do this as well. Serena did it at the Australian Open as well. We can go down the list of people who have done this. I'm not negating, nor do I want to strip the identity of pregnancy away from anyone. Yet at the same time, it's the how. It's how is it used? How is the story told? And Lisa, I just think it's a really good aha moment and warning, considering that we're now about to parlay into Paralympics. And what does that mean? Just as a warning. What does that mean as we continue to enjoy their feats of
Yep.
excellence as well?
Yep.
What does that mean?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a good way to wrap up the show. Today's with that recommendation. Pay attention when you're watching the Paralympics and watch the
Yes.
Paralympics. If you are into the
Hello.
Olympics, watch the Paralympics, right? Don't just pass on that. That's
That's right.
important. And watch for the way that the athletes are spoken about, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I
Absolutely.
think there's probably going to be some things in there that are a little untoward, right? A little inspiration porny, if that is
Mm-hmm.
even a word. Mhm. Mhm.
Lord, yes, I
Yeah.
agree. I agree. So, yes, please watch. In fact, Lisa, what we can do in the show notes is drop how people can watch the Paralympics in the show notes, because I
Yeah,
believe
great
y'all will be
idea. Yep.
listening
Yep.
you'll be listening to this prior to the start. But yes, this is a wrap on this week's podcast. So please remember to
Mhm.
subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Apple Podcast and Spotify. You can follow us on all the other socials, Instagram, LinkedIn. Email us at info@unfazedpodcast.com. But most importantly, we just want you to share. Okay. So share with folks our website, unfazedpodcast.com. Leave a review, share with friends, coworkers, or others in this phase of your life. So, Lisa, until next week.
Until next week. See you, folks.